a biological male. This makes you gay.
Stereotypes.
There's a lot of outrage
accused of inciting violence against
Act. Really controversial topics.
Doomed to their own autonomy.
They're kindergartners.
Our understanding of gender and
because of innate differences, not
trans-inclusive agenda. And what started
Irreversible
gender ideology.
Gender ideology contradicts basic biology. It's incredible. The same progressive movement that once worshipped at the secular altar of science, to the exclusion of God and metaphysics, has turned against its own science is everything dogma. Now, all scientific evidence that disproves the transgender narrative is discarded.
So here we are, and I'm really excited for you today, because it's possible you clicked on this video thinking that you needed to make sure that trans people being gross wasn't being challenged. And if you're here for that, then please, go ahead, leave whatever kind of hateful reply you want in the comment section now. If you haven't seen my other videos, you know what, just watch this one first, because this is really the only video on this topic you'll need, as you might have gathered from the title. So no more preamble, let's get right into it, shall we? In the hierarchy of anti-trans arguments rests one single concept that many believe to be the most relevant in denying the acceptance of trans people. This argument holds that trans people are in some way mentally ill, and as such, said acceptance would only be pandering to or normalizing an illness that should be treated in some other way. The problems with this statement are abundant, without even including that this claim is unambiguously false. But why is that? Definitions of what a mental illness is can differ a lot depending on who you ask, but in general, a mental disorder is a pattern of thought or behavior which leads to significant dysfunction, distress, and disability in a person. Knowing this, it's clear that the act of simply being trans or gender variant in some way does not constitute a mental illness, as simply wanting to present, identify, and or behave in a way contrary to one's expected gender role does not affect a person's ability to function or anything about a person's mental well-being at all. Even though the feeling of debilitating discomfort with one's sexual characteristics, known as gender identity disorder, was once classified by the DSM-4 as a mental illness, in the DSM-5 it was changed to gender dysphoria, a condition which is often argued not to be. The DSM-5 also corroborates the current ideas of sex and gender, and says that gender variance is normal. There was even a conversation around completely removing gender dysphoria from the DSM, but it was decided that it was beneficial for trans people in a general sense, since a diagnosis might need to be obtained for someone to be treated for gender dysphoria in many jurisdictions. In addition, not all trans people experience gender dysphoria, and many others don't experience it as overwhelming or debilitating, or at least not constantly or consistently enough to amount to what is a significant pattern. And most people experience the reduction of said dysphoria upon transition, which is why it is currently recognized by the American Medical Association as part of the standards of care for the treatment of gender dysphoria. Even many of the scientists who have been critical of transition as a treatment for gender dysphoria in various ways still have to admit that this standard appears to produce the most favorable outcome for individuals, otherwise they'd lose any sense of credibility they have at all in this area of science, because transition is so unquestionably, unequivocally, largely positive for all trans people in every single study. I've kind of been circling this point vaguely in my previous videos, but let me tell you, this is probably the most relevant information to this discussion I give in this series, and its implications are massive. Many people believe that transition is largely negative for trans people, contributing to the very large rate of suicide attempts amongst trans people. However, many people on all sides of this issue have no reason to believe that research about transition confirms their position, as they likely believe this research is extremely rare, if it even exists at all. There have been many studies done on the success of transition. In fact, in one systematic review from more than a decade ago, a total of 28 different studies enrolled 1,833 participants with gender identity disorder, and found that 80% of people with gender identity disorder reported significant improvement of gender dysphoria after taking steps to transition, including hormone therapy. However, all these studies were observational, and most lacked controls, and as such this is admittedly only weak evidence. However, a more recent systematic review from March of 2021 of 27 studies found the pooled prevalence of regret for any type of gender-conforming surgery or treatment was less than 1%, with predictors of regret being difficulty and dissatisfaction in their current roles, lack of acceptance, and occasionally feeling their goals had not been met. Most of the regret these people felt was based on social and familial rejection, and that was also what predicted detransition, the desire for societal acceptance in terms of getting jobs, preserving relationships, etc. A closer look at some studies of this nature might give us a little more insight. In a great deal of studies, the sample sizes are very small, but I'll go through a handful of some interesting ones. A long-term study of 107 Belgian trans people found that there was no significant difference in gender dysphoria left after gender reconstruction surgery between the trans subjects and the control groups consisting of their cisgender counterparts without gender dysphoria. This study also found that the suicide attempt rate among these trans people had reduced from 29.3 to 5.1%, and that 88.6% of MTFs and 85.2% of FTMs were happy to very happy with surgery, with only one person from each group occasionally regretting the decision, while continuing to live on as they had regardless. A survey conducted by the Scottish Transgender Alliance found that levels of life satisfaction grew between stages of transition. From the proposal to undergo a process of transition, 31% satisfied versus 50% dissatisfied, currently transitioning, 54 versus 28%, and having undergone some process of transitioning, 75 versus 11%. And this trend was consistent regarding body satisfaction. 85% of those on hormones were more satisfied with their bodies than before, with only 2% being less satisfied, while 82% were more satisfied with their lives, with again only 2% being less satisfied. In another study of only 42 patients, 90% reported they were stable or improved in regards to work situation, partner relations, and sex life. And none of the patients regretted their sex reassignment. In fact, in all studies like this I could find, there are few, if any, individuals who express regret concerning their decision to undergo sex reassignment. The most I could find was a study of 218 subjects, which showed that 3.8% of the patients who underwent sex reassignment measures in Sweden between 1972 and 1992 regretted the measures taken, with the two factors that predicted this regret being lack of support from the family and belonging to the non-core group of transsexuals, which is pretty vague, I'll admit. I did see one very exceptional study that put it at around 94%, though this one was pretty questionable as representative of the greater trans population. In any case, success rates are very high in all of these studies, and the success rate of conservative surgeries and treatments in treating gender dysphoria and improving quality of life and body satisfaction, psychological symptoms, and general improvement of ability and social functioning is similarly high in a litany of other studies. It's clear that in spite of the limitations of many studies of this nature, transition is something that works quite well in quite a lot of ways for quite a lot of people. And there doesn't seem to be alternatives even in terms of just treating gender dysphoria. The only studies I found on successful supposed alternative medical treatments for gender dysphoria only ever refer to extremely rare cases, seemingly always with clear indicators that gender dysphoria symptoms are being misidentified. In one case, a doubtful person experienced cessation of his desires to undergo a sex change after being treated with the antipsychotic drug Fünf. However, I'm not sure if there ever was a long-term follow-up on this person. Again, they were doubtful, and honestly, I wouldn't say someone should have gender confirmation surgery if they didn't have any connection to trans identification, been living openly or taking hormones, and most importantly, who experienced their gender dysphoria apart from their needs and goals as opposed to because of them. But this individual didn't even know what GCS implied. Assuming this did work for this person in the long run, which is tough to say since it only spans 1 year, there's no reason to apply this person's experiences onto everyone for a number of reasons. He had borderline intellectual functioning, and his desires seemed overwhelmingly focused on genital surgery specifically, without an express presence of transgender identity, though he did cross-dress. They write, "It was noted the belief was held with a very strong conviction and could not be shifted, and there was no insight into what sex change would entail in practice. On the basis that he might be suffering from monosymptomatic delusions, it was decided to commence pharmacotherapy with Primazide at the end of 1990, after carrying out a baseline electrocardiogram. This study was interesting to me because of the subject. The use of Primazide seems to have worked both to improve his mood and outbursts and to stop his spontaneous desires. But it's always complicated because the drugs are fairly sedating, as many antipsychotic drugs are, and it can be hard for people with lower cognitive abilities to define their thoughts and give consent in medical treatment. Obviously, the comorbidity of these outbursts and emotional issues with this person's delusions, which only superficially resembled gender dysphoria, and the fact that these mood problems improved alongside these delusions supports the conclusion, at least to some extent, that these two were connected, and this clearly does not represent most trans people. I don't think they did anything wrong here, from what I'm reading. They treated the negative symptoms of this person to the best of their abilities, and that is what is most important. That the person experiences the best outcome, and I can only speculate beyond this. I honestly think these things probably happen more than we know, and there's no doubt people like this exist. But it's only in extremely rare cases that a co-occurring condition can mimic gender dysphoria, usually via a psychotic process which distorts one's view of gender. There is no particular risk in these types of instances being mistreated one way or the other. There's nothing really that wrong about the study overall, but the shortened conclusion in the abstract says that such treatment should be tried in doubtful trans people. And this clearly seems questionable if you don't really look into it. A lot of people could be considered doubtful. Most people experience doubt in crucial areas of their lives. They might even have an outburst or two. I actually only found out about this study from someone trying to use it to imply it had been proven that all trans people were suffering from delusions. Silly. The other study was apparently about a similar doubtful case of gender dysphoria in a person who experienced total remission with Prozac. It was based on a theory by Dr. David Huntley, which held that some people who feel themselves subject to rigid gender stereotypes alongside OCD could develop gender dysphoria. But I couldn't find it. I had heard of such a study and traced it back to a blog, so I emailed them asking if they had a source for his work, and they said they simply knew one of his patients, which made me realize there never was a study conducted. This was just a story someone had said was a study, and as such I couldn't know if it ever happened in practice, let alone as described. Even in context, it wouldn't have really made a difference, because Prozac and other SSRIs are so common in use that if OCD caused gender dysphoria, or if SSRIs had an overwhelming effectiveness in alleviating gender dysphoria, let alone affecting trans identification in general, I'm sure we would have known about that very fascinating fact by now. I'm not even saying Prozac could not affect anxiety related to dysphoria. I'm sure it could. But all cross-sectional and longitudinal studies over the last 5 years assessing depression, 9 in total, reported lower depressive symptoms in both MTF and FTM transgender individuals after receiving hormone treatment. Both cross-sectional and longitudinal studies consistently report a reduction in symptoms of anxiety among middle-aged and elderly transgender adults receiving hormone therapy. Studies have mostly described marked reductions in measures of global psychopathology after the initiation of hormone treatment. More specifically, transgender individuals undergoing these treatments reported better psychological adjustment and lower subject levels of gender dysphoria, lower psychiatric stress and psychological symptoms, and decreased psychoneurotic distress. Several studies confirm a statistically significant improvement in self-reported quality of life in both MTFs and FTMs. Hormonal intervention is also associated with higher levels of body satisfaction and self-esteem. So when you consider the fact that most people who take HRT are considering lifetime use, and that most often these people do take HRT for their entire lives, if you were trying to choose what should be the standard between whatever SSRI and HRT, you would have to not realize this debate was already settled long ago. People also seem to be under the impression that HRT and other drugs can't be used on the same person. The only reasonable explanation for this is that they have no idea what they are talking about. Tell me, why isn't trans identity removed by any drug or any therapy in any instance besides possibly only in a few extremely rare and exceptional cases? Why isn't Prozac, or Premazide, or whatever else, considered the standard of care for gender dysphoria? Is it really unreasonable to at least vaguely forward some kind of essence narrative when many trans people and non-binary people think hormone treatments and surgeries will improve their life, and the overwhelming majority of these people are remarkably correct? At that point, it's certainly not just an assumption that they are who they are. I mean, obviously they knew what they wanted, right? Either way, what remains true is that transition is easily the best and most successful treatment for gender dysphoria, as well as the only treatment widely used. And given how long this topic has been around in the medical literature, that is saying a lot. The only other option that is or has ever been repeatedly used is conversion therapy. But this has already been shown to produce negative psychological side effects with very poor success rates in treating homosexual and transgender people, and has since been rejected by the medical community as a whole. We could discuss what really defines conversion therapy, but I think it's pretty clear. Basically, conversion therapy is telling someone they can't do what they want to do, and taking away their ability to do such things. I could get more into this, but I honestly think the argument for conversion therapy doesn't even need to be tackled, because it doesn't exist. Conversion therapy is more often considered a form of torture than something with any reliability, though in a separate video I might go over how people have tried to wriggle around this definition. In a similar way, a handful of people who have detransitioned, something that is extremely rare, have become overt activists against trans healthcare. These people are often signal boosted by the media and made into representations of the obvious and tragic possibilities of trans regret. Sometimes attempts to garner sympathy over detransition are clear attempts at dissuading others, or making it harder for them to transition, or of encouraging detransition in general. All of these things are things which are harmful for trans people in predictable ways. The trans community does not as a whole push or brainwash people to transition either, nor do those who study trans people or who work with trans people. I think any honest person who wanted to talk earnestly about their detransition would be honest enough to not put their original decisions squarely on the shoulders of other people, and would admit, at least, that they have a say in their own decision making. But that's rarely what you'll see. Instead, you'll far more often see a narrative being pushed that makes all trans people and every healthcare professional they've interacted with in this process seem like careless, bloodthirsty cultists. Most people who detransition are still trans-identified, trans-aligned, or at least trans-allied, with detransition often being predicated by stigmas against trans people and punctuated by increased psychiatric morbidity. I've never met a trans person who took the decision to transition lightly, and who didn't have many years of internal dialogue about the subject before they were able to begin transition medically or socially. But of course, the problem with anything I say about trans people as a whole is that being trans is merely a quality someone can have, and thus doesn't have to come with any kind of specific attitude or opinion. There is not a unification of thought amongst trans people. There is no governing body, no social structure designed to disfellowship and attack those who attempt to leave simply for breaking rank, and no one is ordering you to watch hypnoporn for some ritualistic initiation. That's absurd. All trans people have different ideas about themselves and other trans people, and what it even means to be trans. Sometimes you might see people who appear dogmatic at the surface, and maybe they'll talk out of their ass on certain subjects sometimes, or don't know how to defend themselves well enough to your opinion. My argument is, why should they? Why should they have to prove to you that they are who they say they are and deserve a place in the world? Why do we have to fight to be known? Why do we always have to be reasonable when you try to ban or erase us? Why do you always expect a perfectly calm and properly civil conversation when the topic is to you nothing but a mostly insignificant debate topic, but to trans people a matter of utmost importance? Here we have an obvious imbalance. People tend to lack an essential empathy here, And if you actually cared, you'd do better than to be so uncritical. I don't wish to negate the experiences of detransitioners, but note how rarely they will say the same thing. Note how rarely they'll mention that transition is so effective for so many people, and that most people do not simply fall into medical and surgical transition, but take years of gatekeeping to get through a single point in the process. Note how one-sided the narratives they push are. If I could offer a reason for why their experiences might have felt a certain way, I could say that some trans people project their experiences in fear and hesitation over transition onto others. Or I could say that many well-meaning healthcare workers don't have a lot of knowledge and almost no training in this area. But regardless, I'm just going off anecdotal evidence, which I'll admit makes this argument pretty hollow. But will these detransition activists do the same? Will the people who uncritically buy their narrative do the same? No. Anecdotal evidence is generally all you'll get and all you will need. Throughout this series, I've tried to look at trans people scientifically, and part of doing that is by seeking out errors in my own perception and correcting them. You won't get this honest approach from the gender-critical mob, because admitting that transition works so well for so many people won't sell books, it won't get you donations, and it won't get you an interview with Steven Crowder or retweeted by J.K. Rowling. Earlier, I've mentioned, a few times actually, how gender dysphoria is not specifically a mental illness, but I feel the need to elaborate on the DSM-5's position on this subject one last time. In the section titled Highlights of Changes from DSM-4 to DSM-5, it mentions gender dysphoria as a new diagnostic class, which reflects a change in the conceptualization of the disorder's defining features, by emphasizing the phenomenon of gender incongruence, rather than cross-gender identification per se. What this is trying to say is that while the distress of gender incongruence can be a mental disorder, or at least mentally distressing, simply having a trans identity is not. This is all worth mentioning because of what it says about trans people and mental illness. Transition is not an attempt to promote or poorly cope with the mental illness of cross-gender identification, like giving an alcoholic more alcohol, as I've heard several people put it. Instead, it is the only provably consistent and successful method for treating, limiting, or outright removing gender dysphoria. The medical literature agrees with this. The major medical associations of the world generally agree with this. It is very much the standard in most of the world. When the 11th revision of the International Classification of Diseases rolled out in January of this year, gender incongruence was not under mental and behavioral disorders, but under conditions related to sexual health. To believe that all of this is fabricated and based on lies is to believe that thousands of professionals who specialize in this topic are all paid off or are all threatened by some global trans cabal. Is to believe that these people fundamentally all know they are wrong and that they are promoting something they know to be unhelpful to people and that they don't care, thus implying that they are all corrupt, if not outright evil. It's absurd. And it is insulting as someone who has done a lot of research in this area and knows many trans people. But this is how uninformed anti-trans arguments tend to be. They don't understand this topic at all. Still, some argue that transition has been shown to negatively impact the mental health of individuals. Most often they refer to the suicide rate of trans people, with a bizarre level of frequency. People will cite a certain Swedish study, which concluded that transsexuals who underwent sex reassignment had a much higher risk of suicidal behavior and psychiatric morbidity than the general population. Here is someone on Twitter sending me this study while I was working on this video. In this case, it was the Splificator. Every time I've heard someone argue that transition actually increases suicide risk in trans-identified people, they were referencing this study. However, the control group of this study was not trans-identifying people who did not undergo sex reassignment, but instead, again, the general populace. Meaning, as the study itself admits, it is completely impossible to draw any conclusions as to the effectiveness of sex reassignment as a treatment for transsexualism based on this data, which itself is a very outdated perception that we were just talking about, and that people who quote this study don't understand because they have no context. What this study really shows, if anything, is that trans people are at a much higher risk of suicide and psychiatric morbidity than others, with the implication that sex reassignment was the cause for this being a completely unfair assumption that many people who have cited this study have made on their own. It even admits to the fact that things may have been worse for the subjects without sex reassignment. What the study goes on to suggest in its conclusion is that sex reassignment is clearly not sufficient in lowering trans people's risk for morbidity and mortality. The problem with the conclusion of this study, which I've also heard in many of the arguments I've seen which cite it, is the assertion that transsexualism, or transgenderism, or non-binary and transition are themselves strong risk factors for suicide. The continued use of statements like sex reassigned persons were at increased risk for suicide attempts gives the average reader, perhaps intentionally, the impression that sex reassignment itself increases this risk. But the implication that transition or transgender identity itself is a strong risk factor for suicide ignores a legitimate possibility. Trans people may be motivated to commit suicide by forces outside their identification. I'm going to try to be as real as possible to you here, and I'm sorry if this is triggering to people. Based on the reasons many trans people and their families give for why they or their loved one committed suicide, it is clear that simple gender dysphoria is not the expressed reason for this if it is mentioned or alluded to at all. Instead, the main reason often seems to be the lack of acceptance, discriminatory behavior, and negative attitudes that they face. You can say this is in poor taste somehow, but I've included a list of 8 examples of trans people who gave reasons for wanting to commit suicide at some point before doing so. And none of them seem to consider their gender dysphoria a factor, based on my own analysis of their words, of course. One of these references their fears of becoming unappealing through puberty, or something to that effect, but does so because of their obvious fears of becoming outcast due to being visibly trans. You're welcome to check if you think otherwise, because these people's experiences are important, and that's why I've included them. Of course, it's impossible for anyone to know exactly the reason these people chose to end their own lives. And this is all anecdotal, you could argue. But there is evidence that shows that discrimination and the high suicide rate of trans people go hand in hand. The National Center for Transgender Equality's 2015 study of over 28,000 subjects, the largest study of its kind, found that trans people face discrimination in many different ways. 77% of those who were out or perceived as trans in school, K through 12, faced some form of mistreatment. 17% experienced treatment so bad, in fact, that they ended up leaving school. 16% reported losing a job because of their identity or expression. 30% said they had been homeless at some point in their lives, and respondents were 4 times less likely to own a home than the general population. Many experienced discrimination by police, by bosses, co-workers, homeless shelters, healthcare providers, family members, and complete strangers. 40% had attempted suicide in their lifetime compared to 4.6% of the general population. And not to claim correlation is causation myself, but it is at least relevant that 39% of respondents experienced serious psychological distress in the month before completing the survey, compared to 5% of the US population. A study in Thailand, which compared 129 transgender females to 131 cisgender males, reported significantly higher family rejection, lower social support, higher loneliness, higher depression, lower protective factors, and higher negative risk factors related to suicidal behavior among the trans women. In another instance, a study collected data from trans people aged 16 plus in Ontario, Canada, including 380 who reported on suicide outcomes, and found that those with strong support from their families were 82% less likely to attempt suicide. Another study in Ontario showed that transgender youth whose families rejected their identities were 13 times more likely to attempt suicide than transgender youth that were supported by their parents. This study also showed that 70% of those parents who were strongly supportive of their gender identity and expression reported positive mental health, as compared to 15% of those whose parents were not strongly supportive. Various studies have shown that discrimination in employment, healthcare, housing, and accommodations are all very common. And other evidence shows that violence, abuse, and harassment against trans individuals is another common occurrence and a major mental health problem. One study found that people who are seen as trans or gender nonconforming are more likely to have attempted suicide, while another study of male to female trans people who had gender reassignment surgery and or facial feminization surgery showed that these trans women reported qualities of life not significantly different from the general population. These 2 studies seem to suggest that being able to undergo medical transition, as well as being seen as cisgender male or female while trans, causes the high risk of suicide among trans people to be reduced by a very large amount. Apart from these possible causes for the increased risk of suicide from trans people, internalized feelings of transphobia have also been shown to play a role, with the same study that suggests this showing a higher rate of attempts of suicide among black trans people than white trans people, which isn't surprising when you reconsider the massively high rate of violence against trans women, and especially black trans women. With all this in mind, it's clear that hatred, disgust, and systematic injustice are what harm trans people the most, not gender ideology. Through racism, imposed conversion therapy, murder, violence, physical, sexual, and mental abuse, and moreover the complete isolation and othering with one's own family, community, and in-group, trans people are consistently forced to be invisible and treated with contempt just for existing. It's not being confused or deluded that makes trans people consider suicide. And if you actually cared about trans people and suicide, that would be an important thing for you to mention, maybe. In spite of all this, however, many people still cling to the belief that trans people are all categorically wicked and perverted, even without the hard evidence to show that that is the truth. Instead, they trust in anecdotes and prejudice, and normalize an abusive attitude that actually does have a demonstrable impact on trans people. Furthermore, even if trans people were all mentally ill, and the distress this illness caused was directly linked to their suicide rate, surprisingly enough, this would not change the way it should be treated or the kinds of treatments available, because not only is transition clearly the best option, but it is the only option that is generally ever used anywhere or that has any predictable success rate in treating the negative psychological symptoms of gender dysphoria. It's encouraging to imagine some magic pill that makes every aspect of transness itself fade from a person's mind. If you hate trans people, that is, but we still need something to actually be helping people who do exist. That is, not running them through some completely random gauntlet of drugs or therapy that don't have the same massive success rates. Being trans is not definitively a mental illness in any sense, however, and what is more curious is how the claim to the contrary so often gets treated as evidently true. It's as if mental illness is somehow just the default explanation, in spite of their obvious ignorance of what that means, with various arguments being used to support this in lieu of evidence. Oftentimes these arguments will manifest as some kind of slippery slope, a tactic that's not surprising to see given how common it's been in anti-gay arguments of the past. In this case, the argument suggests that accepting transgender people is somehow bound to lead to the acceptance of transracial, trans-age, trans species, or other kin, or countless other forms of trans something people. Issues which are held as so tacitly ridiculous that they couldn't possibly be taken seriously. Never mind, they have no reason to believe that one will lead to the other. Even humoring the idea, it's hard to imagine what racially transitioning would even entail. Other slippery slopes, honestly, are just as, if not more, easy to argue against, by the way. I'm actually choosing the strongest examples. For instance, age is an aspect of the passage of time, and as such is not really open for interpretation. Gender identity is about behavior and self-assessment, and as such is personal, unique, and variable, and differs in expression from person to person and culture to culture. You also can't change your age, and you can't change your species, your sex, your sexuality, or your gender identity, because these are all objective truths. Trans is just one of the ways a person's sex, gender, and gender identity can be ordered. A description of an instance where the typical relationship between the mind and the parts of the body go against expectations. Trans X is not similar to transgender people, because labeling oneself as X relies on references to states your brain and your body overall could not possibly be in. I mean, how would being analogous in the transition element in any of these arguments prove some similarity in the compared items' connections to nature and or nurture? As far as I'm concerned, I don't need to provide evidence these things aren't somehow related. You need to show that they are. What about trans people versus attack helicopters? What's the similarity there? Can we show that they do have other aspects in common? Well, technically showing that they do would require those people to have been studied, and thus to exist in enough numbers for such a thing to have happened. But more importantly, a transracial person or other kin's brain, for instance, really can't show us anything even if that was the case, because race itself is not found in the brain, and neither is wolf. See, the response to these sorts of arguments is actually pretty simple, but requires you to kind of establish a framework of premises that are all true and that you can demonstrate. But this is hard to do live. It relies on a knowledge that people who know nothing about the subject don't already know, and as such it can be hard, if not impossible, to explain it to them in a brief response in front of an audience. Especially if they repeatedly cut you off, lie constantly, and talk sternly and forcefully like they're frustrated with your stupidity even when they say things that are simply absurd. Gay people have been and still are spurned in similar ways, because the argument relies on the ignorant assumption that being gay or trans is just a choice one makes via some disordered process, and not an immutable characteristic. It is a position entirely based on the political goals of the position holder. There's something in all our brains affecting all our thoughts and behaviors, though. And I wouldn't say the trans whatever person should be despised for that alone or anything. That seems to be the implications of these arguments, that I must be repulsed by the hypothetical attack helicopter. That's why this argument trips people up, I think, because in their minds, they're kind of unconsciously trying to work from the assumption that the attack helicopter is doing something wrong, and should never have its discordant delusions enforced upon society for fear of hurting others or themselves. Don't worry about that helicopter. It's way happier and more successful and more interesting and more attractive and cool than you are or ever will be. It doesn't care what you think. I personally don't really even see a problem, but hey, maybe that's an unpopular opinion. I'm not saying no one has the right to be critical of someone like Rachel Dolezal. No trans person I've ever met or heard thinks that, in spite of what right-wing media will have you believe. I just don't see it as some huge issue that needs addressing, as though it's about to take over and destroy society in some way that is never really explored. And I refuse to hate people who aren't themselves violent or hateful. Again, I feel people focus on the wrong things. Of course, a common argument, often used by supposed radical feminists who reject transgender people, has been that trans women's identities result from a kind of sexist stereotyping. I'm not saying there are not trans people who hold unhealthy gender stereotypes. Gender stereotypes are incredibly common, after all, but I do wish to help others in understanding transgenderism, and why the typical narrative exists. You see, whatever causes a person to identify as trans is not exactly known, and is likely different for different people. Transgenderism is such a little understood and vastly difficult to define thing that this has to be true. After all, it's certainly not true that all trans people experience their identities, or where it exists, gender dysphoria, in the same ways. Even two people identifying specifically as trans women can and do typically have great numbers of differences. Some people experience a large amount of dysphoria around their genitals, and others do not. Some people have dysphoria over particular aspects of their life or bodies that others don't. Some people don't experience dysphoria at all, or only slightly, or in certain situations that others don't. And some trans people admit to any number of reasons for feeling trans, with no one narrative being the exact same as any other. Many adopt certain titles not purely grounded in a gender binary. Yes, even when they still call themselves women. Even transgender people who strictly reject non-binary genders are surprisingly all not the same. The only explanation which seems to make sense for all of this is that whatever does cause a person to be trans or non-binary, even if it were down to only one factor, is not happening to everyone who identifies as such to the same extent or in the same ways. And it's obviously true, both based on current science and just pure common sense, that there is not only one factor. With this in mind, the existence of multiple identities apart from the gender binary makes sense, and moreover should be expected, because any one description or title meant to frame a person's gender identity is essentially valid in a sense. Because what we can point to that is valid is the person's behavior and experience. And once you actually look at non-binary gender identities, you find a fascinating linguistic pattern which is meant to define these things. This means a person who identifies as a trans woman, for instance, due to her desire to present feminine behavior, assume female roles, and partake in the feminine toilet, is not describing the female experience with all or some of those aspects. She is merely prescribing the identity of female to herself as a way of giving definition to her feelings, thoughts, and desires. There is a meaningful and important distinction between what is a personally prescribed identity and a societally enforced one. When Shania Twain sings "The best thing about being a woman is the prerogative to have a little fun," or when Cyndi Lauper contends that girls just want to have fun, neither of them are forwarding an essentialist position and imposing this upon their listeners. They don't decry all people who disagree with the connection between women and fun, and neither do trans women deciding why they think they, personally, have always been female. Just as it was last time, and the time before that. Trans people not being women is essential to there being a difference between trans women and cis women. That makes trans women not women. And it's completely circular, you see. What is plainly obvious is that trans people are at a much higher risk of being harmed or dismissed by others than of harming and dismissing others themselves. The main problem with the trans whatever phenomenon, or the belief that all trans people are some heavily essentialist class of gender stereotype enforcers, in the end is that they're such obscure cases that it's really very difficult to comment on them in the first place. And in fact, apart from a few crackpot exceptions, trans whatevers don't seem to exist at all. But transgender and non-binary people in general clearly do exist in large numbers and have existed in some form within a multitude of cultures throughout history. Now, I'm going to mispronounce a lot of things in this segment. I tried to figure out how to pronounce things, but every single one of these words wasn't provided with any kind of pronunciation guide, so I'm kind of just winging it. In Egypt, inscribed pottery shards found near Thebes dating back to the Middle Kingdom depict 3 genders of humanity: man, woman, and eunuch. While it is likely that eunuch referred to exclusively homosexual men who did not reproduce and not actual castrated men or some ancient form of trans people, still interesting how these ancient Egyptians had a way of classifying differences between the sexes as something other than a binary. The Mashoga and East African Swahili-speaking societies were described as biological men who sometimes dress like women, do women's work, and are even sometimes known by women's names. In pre-colonial and early 20th century East Africa, certain male priests are known to have dressed as women and married other men. These individuals are known as Mugawe to the Merokukiyu of Kenya, Ikahindu and Ikemaze among the Hutu and Tutsi people of Burundi and Rwanda, and Ashtime to the Malay people of Ethiopia. The Teso people of Uganda have reported a separate category for men who dress as women. European colonists recorded more than 2 gender categories among some Native American tribes, and deemed men who assumed female roles as the derogatory Burdash, more recently replaced by the term two-spirit, and women who took on masculine roles as passing women. Though not all tribes have been accepting of transgender people, and obviously a lot of Native American culture and history was destroyed and displaced along with a lot of the people themselves. In South Asia, Hijra are eunuchs, or more like hermaphrodite in English. Hijra are more often similar to trans women than just castrated men though, adopting feminine roles in clothing, and may undergo an initiation rite known as nirvan, involving the removal of the penis, testicles, and scrotum. The Anare were ancient shaman of Scythia. They were described as androgynous and adopted female roles. They also had no temples and worshipped nature. They sound pretty cool. The Fa'afafine, people of Samoa, are assigned male at birth and embody both male and female traits. These individual gender expressions can range in terms of masculinity and femininity, but are recognized as a third gender in Samoan culture, and have been since the early 20th century. They also often mention growing up seeing themselves as women, wearing women's clothing and playing with female typical toys in arguably a similar way as many trans women in the West. It's necessary to note that many social and political systems are in place throughout the world that were or are subjugating these people in some way. But it is interesting how all the previous examples and many more suggest that atypical gender roles and identities have existed for a very long time, and all over the world. This is especially interesting in how it competes with the argument that gender and sex minority identities are exclusively Western and modern phenomenon, and also goes to further show how gender identities and roles are defined and adopted by individuals and societies, and are not always binary. It's pretty typical to hear people complain about the apparent contradiction of gender supposedly being a social construct, while transgender people seek to change their bodies or behavior, but this is misleading. It mischaracterizes gender as a social construct as though it means gender is meaningless and wrong. Gender behavior is often divided into redundant categories, clearly more often defined by cultural traditions and stereotypes than some sort of innate difference. In any case, gender is ultimately a kind of personal experience that is grounded in the objective facts of your body and mind. It's silly to believe that one ought to live up to the standards of normal gendered behavior in order to be accepted. And if you watched the previous video of this series, you should know that human brains are not exceptionally dimorphic. Once, when working as a cashier when I was 21, I had a woman come through my line holding a kind of wallet you don't often see women use. She spoke loudly enough for me and everyone else in my line to hear that this was not her wallet, but her husband's, and that she would never be using it if she didn't have to. I remember her saying this and then arguing in essence that while she was properly feminine, you never know what people will be like these days. I couldn't help but notice, however, in spite of her insistence in the essential nature of gender norms, she was wearing pants. When I was a kid, every woman in my family wore pants, and it wasn't until much later that I even learned that wearing pants had ever been considered inappropriate for women. As I said at the very beginning of this series, if you watched it and can remember that far back, women wearing pants used to be a horrible thing for society. Allegedly, but it seems somehow to no longer be one. Almost as if there was really no reason for it to be one in the first place. A detractor to this idea would need to give an example of changing gender norms having actually harmed society. And far from that being the case, the only people even trying to make such an argument are all clearly arguing in such bad faith to an extent that I don't want to respond to them and give the impression that their arguments were at all intended to stand up to scrutiny. A lot of people like to inject these old, nasty evolutionary psychology positions from scientists decades ago trying to argue against affirmative action. I refuse to believe an honest person would be that far behind on this topic if they cared about it at all. In any case, doing gender, so to speak, is not itself an essentialist action. Gender stereotype behavior is so broad, everyone falls into it. Everyone has preferences that, in essence, they did not choose. Gender is omnirelevant, and a society with no predisposed gender roles would not remove the behavior which might have been interpreted as gendered, and it wouldn't remove trans people. In fact, such a hypothetical society would have likely advanced language to an extent that most people were some kind of non-binary gender in terms of presentation, though this is just speculative, of course, since no such society exists. Trans people's experiences run counter to what simple mechanistic views of gender hold, which is why it's silly to think that trans people essentialize gender by wanting to change their bodies to better harmonize with their personal experience. It's no surprise trans people have been such vocal segments of the population advocating for queer and feminist issues. So, is the binary sex model a strong predictor of gender? Of course it is, because that's what the word means. Sometimes I'll see people who cite studies like this one to suggest that gender is not made up. The authors of this study were attempting to compete with the notion that socialization processes were the primary force of sex differences in toy play. They mentioned a handful of different studies which corroborated their general idea. These studies, some on humans, some on monkeys, showed that boy toys preferences were, for the most part, stereotypically masculine, while girls' toy preferences were more varied, but did lean towards the stereotypically feminine. At least it was with these human females. The female monkeys were much harder to pin down. This is an argument against the concept that socialization is the primary force in behavioral differences in children's toy play. But it's an older study which doesn't reference the roles of brain plasticity, and wouldn't have anyway because it's never really been looked into that much in monkeys. Though there have been studies on mother rhesus monkeys and how infant sex was a significant predictor of infant grooming and other factors of maternal investment. Of course, there were studies about the role of child rearing practices in behavior in rhesus monkeys specifically, several decades before this, but obviously studying monkeys is a bit different than humans. Some of these early studies focused on weird, inhumane experiments in social isolation, before people decided that even if that could teach us something about ourselves, it wasn't worth it to find out by removing any chance of monkeys ever knowing or being known by others, because living with nothing but shadows and cold dummies meant to represent a caregiver is incredibly unhealthy, as it turns out. Later studies about behavioral development in monkeys focus mostly on things like nursery-reared and mother-reared studies, or studies about children of abusive mother monkeys, or whatever else. But more importantly, the trend they find in this study presents a clear indication that behavior in monkeys is not split perfectly between just two possible categories. Obviously, everyone can tell that the vast majority of cis people, and thus the vast majority of people, do conform to gender norms in at least a very broad sense. So it is clear that in our brains and in our minds as people, there is a greater amount of variation than what we'd expect from a binary view, and that there's not a binary in gender, and that there's not even a binary in sex. In any case, we humans have in us an essential agency and a superior pattern processing, one which allows us, and in fact encourages us, especially as we grow and develop into adults, to make decisions not associated with the roles which are expected of us. And we are always free to interpret the origins and implications of our own behavior in any way we want. You don't have to consider stereotypically masculine behavior to make you stereotypically masculine. You might say such behavior is no challenge to your femininity, or embrace the masculine elements of it. But the truth is that there's not a good reason whatsoever that one perception of said behavior is more valid than the other. Or at the very least, no good argument one can make which objectively says that anyone is wrong in their own interpretation in any meaningful and objective way, as being wrong is kind of meaningless here. The fact that some people act differently from others is pretty good evidence that some people are different from others. Even establishing that something has an evolutionary and innate purpose that is not saying what ought to be. Regardless if certain interpretations are less common, there is no reason to believe that said behavior should, or even truly could, be essentialized. with its constantly shifting, context-dependent categorizations, because doing so would necessarily lead to a system in which subjective interpretations of behavior and societal norms were treated as a moral or personal obligation, with those that do not conform to the majority being regarded as repulsive or disgusting, all by justification of an already incredibly flimsy naturalistic fallacy. Accepting that socialization and environmental processes play a part in gendered behavior, and that gendered behavior should not and could not be essentialized is not the same as saying most people do not conform to the norms, or that there is no innate quality guiding them. It is explaining why people conform to the norms, even when they don't really have any good reason to believe that those norms should be norms. This is perhaps more philosophical than you'd like it to be, but I've never heard any good justification at all ever for any of the ways historically and presently socially enforced standards which suppress healthy behaviors that have no negative effect on anyone have any reason to be that way or put people at a terrible disadvantage if they aren't. I would have to hope that no rational person would ever accept such an argument and would instead fully and unequivocally reject it. There are a number of things which define human behavioral differences, though the study we were just talking about admits that toy play specifically is one of the most robust of these human behavioral differences. Even in monkeys there was a decent amount of individuals that did not conform to the norm. One quote from the study: "Sex differences in maternal treatment do not include preventing their male or female offspring from engaging in opposite sex type behavior or encouraging them to interact with specific objects. It's almost like gender variance in expression is itself a natural condition of intelligent social mammals, and gender essentialization is not, though of course I don't want to fall into the naturalistic fallacy trap myself. Still, I will have people quote the study to me saying it proves that socialization couldn't have anything to do with behavior, which is an extremely silly concept in itself that doesn't even compete with the view of gender I talked about in the last video, but also as if this is some problem for trans people. People seem to be under the impression that all behavior is just down to simple binary causative mechanisms and not multiple far more complicated systems. That was also something we discussed in the last video. They also seem to think they can read one study completely divorced from any context and somehow understand what it's saying without admitting any limitation. Their perspective has no depth. I actually found this study and the information that it gives in general to be rather fascinating and enriching in a way to this discussion. But some people want to say I think the opposite and that this study alone has destroyed me. As if a scientist would ever say something so absolute that was debatable in a peer-reviewed paper or make a claim of proof outside of mathematics. As if anyone who cared about mental health would find comfort in seeing a group of people they recognize as being at a high risk for suicide destroyed. The gay community often sees itself victim to similar tactics of dismissal. Analogies and slippery slopes are common there as well. It's worth noting, however, that the discussion about the cause of homosexuality has not been explained in some tidy and convenient way. Yes, there has been some headway in the scientific literature in this area, but the singular gay gene, finding 100% consistent indicator of homosexuality, has not been found, and isn't a realistic thing to look for, and homosexuality being monogenetic would honestly suck anyway, because people like Michael Bailey would be arguing for gene therapy. But furthermore, this would not truly tell us everything about the variations of non-heterosexual identities. These are too different, rarely quite malleable, but oftentimes quite distinct, and overall, they're not exactly the same. Since gay rights are now supported by the majority of people in the US, you no longer seem to be under the obligation to show you are gay somehow amongst the majority of people. The fact that you know you are gay is good enough. You don't have to prove the existence of gay people or present the findings on other gay people's brains. You're not asked to prove that you are truly gay or bi or pan or whatever by forcing some scan of your brain, or whatever other sci-fi concept you can think of that wouldn't really tell you anything anyway, or by asking other people if they happen to agree. You don't have to prove that you exist and that you're not experiencing delusions to the satisfaction of Ben Shapiro. Not only can no method other than acceptance truly help you deal with the reality of your sexuality, no other method allows for the agency of just being who you are. Bodily autonomy overrules concerns about what is supposedly natural and the fallacious nature of value put onto this highly flawed definition of nature. Hypothetically, Let's say some kind of medication or form of therapy comes around that can consistently treat gender dysphoria and doesn't involve medical and surgical transition. Obviously, we're assuming here that the trans people in this hypothetical example experience dysphoria and desires not just habitually but also medically and surgically to transition. Keep in mind that there currently exists no form of medication or therapy which comes anywhere near to having a 100% success rate in treating all symptoms of any mental illness, assuming gender dysphoria is one, and that people often react to these things, especially drugs, in wildly different ways, even before considering the possibility of allergies, side effects, or adverse reactions with other drugs. The studies I mentioned about the success rates of transition, in fact, reveal transition as so strikingly effective a treatment in comparison to the treatments of other medical conditions. It's incomparable. To give an example, antidepressants, for instance, show around 60% of patients respond by about 2 months to the drugs with about a 50% reduction of symptoms. But this includes a large number of different drugs of that category, which must be chosen for the individual based on efficacy and tolerability. Sometimes this happens after long trial and error periods of using different drugs, and about 80% of people stop taking antidepressants after a couple months anyway. Even studies that showed success rates of transition and treating gender dysphoria to be relatively on the absolute lowest end have greater success rates than antidepressants in general in treating depression. Isn't it interesting that depression does not have any very precise treatments, but gender dysphoria does? Sure, comparing these two things has a number of issues and may seem pretty silly, I admit, but the point I'm trying to make here is that transition is apparently so effective that its rate of effectiveness only makes sense if those who undergo it already know on some level that it will be effective. This is because trans people know that they are trans in the same way people know their sexuality. This is why asserting that some alternative transition should be standard has so many issues at the face of it. It is unrealistic to expect anything to work better for trans people, when transition is not only remarkably effective, but represents the following through of long-held, deep-rooted desires, whatever alternative treatments that come around for gender dysphoria. Even if they can be shown to work for a large number of people, will not change the fact that some people will still desire to transition. Alleviating the distress that gender dysphoria causes does not mean that many will simply stop feeling the need to express themselves however they please, even if something could remove these feelings as well, because most trans people have felt the way they do about their gender identity for many years, often since childhood. And these feelings are typically a very large part of who they are and how they act as people and see themselves in their role in the world. So let me be clear, a hypothetical miracle cure that could completely cause all these feelings to vanish is not a cure. It is an example of eugenics. Regardless of what science ever comes to conclude about the desires for gender nonconformity or to transition medically or otherwise, people seem to be under the impression that some single trans-making process will eventually be discovered and then summarily eradicated. It is disturbing. Even a hypothetical scan by which true trans people could be identified would not be a method all trans people would subject themselves to, nor would it be ethical to impose this on people either if doing so meant they'd be denied medical treatments. If I could offer a more realistic scenario for these people, what's more likely to happen, if any such thing ever could, is some treatment will come around that has a provable success rate in treating gender dysphoria, comparable to, if not better than, transition itself, and most trans people will live on as they choose, still deciding to transition, following their desires without the distress of gender dysphoria. Trans people are not going to simply vanish, no more than gay or lesbian people will, as people will always insist that they be allowed to do as they please, and pushing to maintain the stigma against these people can only do harm to a group of people who have done nothing wrong. Ultimately, trans people need to and will find acceptance by society as time passes, and passing legislation against this not only delays the inevitable but proves to ostracize and debase trans people. People need to understand that transgender people are what they say they are, and even simply stating, "I don't care what you do as long as you're not hurting anyone," is not sufficient when accompanied by the idea that trans people should not be treated as the person they identify as in all legal areas, or when trans people are delegitimized with language that does not accept trans identities. Not accepting trans people in these ways promotes a stigma that fails to value the bodily autonomy of people to decide for themselves how they wish to behave, and the immutable reality of their bodies and minds. Trans people do not choose to be trans, and being treated legitimately and with empathy in regards to their unique experiences is key. Trans and non-binary people are valid, and we can only move forward in accepting that. We will not move forward if we continue to reject it. If you've already decided trans people are lesser, or a detestable cult trying to dismantle society, or a perversion of the natural order, I can't really convince someone like you otherwise, because anything I say will always be untrustworthy to you as long as I'm not nodding along and thanking you for letting me have a piece of myself in exchange for spreading your propaganda. Part of this issue is a question of philosophy, and a person who views the world through the lens of battling a war against malignant political correctness that the majority, if not all, trans people enforce thoughtlessly, is only interested in furthering that agonizing, inexorable delusion. They don't want to help. They don't want to understand. They don't want to be good to people. In their view, the casement of empathy is sealed shut. Someone who cares and is legitimately concerned about the well-being of trans people naturally would question transition's viability in dealing with gender dysphoria, but they'd also be empathetic and willing to listen and not willing to discount every single trans person as some moral or mental failure. Instead, so many of the anti-trans folks you find online relish in the pain of trans people, confusing attempted suicide rate with the actual suicide rate, because of course, how could they get even one thing right? They mentioned 40% suicide rate, not as something that concerns them, but as something that is funny to them. I can hope that this information will convince some of the nastier ones somewhere down the line, but mostly this is for the people who actually care. The people who accept that being trans and or non-binary is real. The gender variance and gender nonconformity have existed in cultures around the world since the dawn of humanity, still exist now, and will continue to exist long into the future. There is nothing anyone can do to stop it. We've broken the curse that requires trans people to be invisible and unknown, the one which forces us to debase or segregate ourselves physically or linguistically or figuratively or any other adverb you can imagine. We are here now. You won't lock us away, and I guarantee any who try will fail. So we better all start figuring out how to live with it. But before I go, I'd like to leave you with one last thought. So recently I went through and watched a lot of the old skeptic YouTube videos I watched in my late teens, ones which largely inspired the original drafts of this video. People like Aaron Raw and Potholer54 and the old James Randi videos on YouTube. I quickly realized that I'd almost forgotten the fact that James Randi came out as gay in 2012 at 81 years old. The discussion had in the video in which he does this was very fascinating to me, both then and now. Randi talks about how he felt others would judge him preemptively if he came out, but says this isn't necessarily why he didn't. Instead, he just didn't feel strongly enough about the issue. He didn't want to be tied down to the identity of gay magician or gay skeptic. I mean, why should he have to justify his own sense of identity? His own sense of self? His love for his partner? I do not doubt Randi was telling the truth when he says he was never in denial, and never made an attempt to hide it, though it is apparent that he certainly waited about as long as he could before coming out publicly. I remember thinking how that was kind of sad. Not that he was sad, or a sad person. He seems to have been quite the opposite, in fact. Just that it was sad that being gay was so stigmatized throughout his entire life, that coming out really would have labeled him as gay first above all other considerations, and would have forced him to defend his very being. That's an incredibly upsetting thought, that being gay, being unlike the majority of other people in preference or presentation, or in the choices one makes about their lives, so often heavily defines us as distinct categories from all others. That's incredibly alienating. He talks about being just down the street as the Stonewall riots in New York were happening in 1969, and not having a particular interest in being involved. One person who was involved in the riots said it was clear that things were changing. People who had felt oppressed now felt empowered. In the next few years after this, gay rights groups began to form in every major city. It sparked a new rise in activists who were eager to assist in the struggle for gay rights. Activists stormed an APA conference about behavior modification in homosexual subjects on May of 1970. They shouted exclamations of torture and were probably thought of as appealing heavily to emotion over reason by the scientists who walked out, though of course intense emotions were justified. In December of 1973, the APA voted unanimously to remove homosexuality from the DsM. One part of the video in which James Randi came out, however, gave me pause. It comes right at the end.
So, in a real way, I think gay issues are skeptics' issues.
Yes, I would say they are. Indeed, I see a close relationship. I share your opinion on that, DJ, and I think that could be developed a little bit more. as a matter of fact, and maybe we should put a bit of emphasis on it eventually when the occasion calls for it.
Now, I do not want to give the impression that Randy should be criticized for not being a good enough ally, but if not in the 60s or 70s and not back in 2012, then when is said occasion? When will skeptical and caring people who support the rights of all people finally decide to tackle the pseudoscience and prejudices of those who oppose those things? How else will it ever become anything other than a challenge and a struggle simply to be known? I feel many people fear falling into arguments for emotion over reason, or are not able or willing to tackle such personal topics of sexuality and gender identity because of that connotation. But often topics surrounded in heavy emotions are like that for a reason, and are especially important for that same reason. Honestly, watching skeptic videos on YouTube changed me as a young trans atheist kid in a highly religious and conservative little Alabama town. A series of videos about evolution or climate change was incredibly affirming to me, not because of the content specifically. Instead, it gave me hope and knowledge of a world that existed beyond my immediate environment. One which wasn't afraid to challenge the erroneous notions that I'd been conditioned to believe were simply fact. My hope was always that this video in this series could somehow be affirming to someone in that same way, because being known and knowing others is an essential part of what it is to be. You do not and should not have to die for people to know your name. I know you are sick of shadows.